Hello there, and welcome back to another episode of our Arcane Adventures Recapped. We will be recapping the events of the Lorem Ipsum campaign as we move through Chapter 8, titled Breakthrough. Now, a disclaimer, this chapter is substantially longer than some of our other chapters, and so be prepared to cover 19 episodes worth of content in this recap. However, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the recap. Lorem Ipsum and the Moxicral family, that is Aldrich's family, including Ocarek, Daikia, Trerthek, and Irsi, departed from Akis with urgency, retracing the party's steps southward until they arrived once more at the Cozy Cupboard, a quite okay stay, to reclaim their horses from the innkeeper, Natar. With Brontero as their next destination, discussions turned to what should be done with Ocarek and the children, while Daikia and Lorem Ipsum would head in search of Akadon in the Frostbitten Waste. Though most of Lorem Ipsum were uneasy about bringing additional companions into the danger, Daikia, with Paloma's support, was reluctant to part ways with her family. Eventually, hesitantly, she agreed it might be safest to send them to Lorem Ipsum's residence in Provenere, the Cosal Chateau. Of course, getting them there safely posed its own challenge. Still, the journey along the royal road was, for the most part, smooth. Paloma taught Irsi some basic monk's techniques, while Trerthek trained in archery with Pura, in spite of a few arrows to the shoulder. Pura also continued reading from the strange book recovered from Xeros's cabinet, identifying a list of unknown deities. One, named Kakathumath, caught Sizik's attention. He recognized it from a mountain pass in Iazlan said to house a gargantuan skeleton. Owenal spent much of the journey in prayer to Helm, reflecting on recent events and vowing renewed vigilance. He and Sizik shared a heartfelt conversation about Evidin, her death, his grief, and the burden of telling their parents. Ultrix dedicated time to repairing the combustion siphon after his last encounter with the genie, and briefly communicated with Raylan Vost, who informed him of unrest growing in the twin reservoirs and admitted that she missed him. Rancor checked in with Marigold Burrows regarding the status of the Cosal Chateau, who reported it was functioning profitably and shared that the Red Shielders had been fully dissolved by the Supervisory. Rancor also spent a great deal of time trying to reconnect with Ozin, who has remained eerily silent since the events in Akis. The group passed through the forest village of Hyrain, then into the Yadawel Peaks via the Valley of Three Swords. There, Sizik took a leap of faith, literally, soaring on the back of a giant eagle to speak with Celia atop one of the massive metal blades. She revealed that Sizik was a prophet of fate, and that he would soon understand the deeper importance of Lorem Ipsum's missions and bonds. Upon returning to camp, Sizik shared a vulnerable moment with Rancor, speaking of his past pain and the weight of recent events. And Rancor thanked Sizik for being there for him and hinted that he was perhaps the one that had provided Sizik with the puzzle box. But as Rancor turned to leave, Sizik's eyes flared with golden light, and he began to chant a cryptic prophecy. Keeper of knowledge, bright in shade, pale in color, hidden by blade, secret foretold, tower of ice, steal the scepter and bear the price. Repeating the verse with growing intensity, Sizik caught fire, the tent caught fire, the ground cracked beneath him, the magical surge continued until Rancor cast command and ordered Sizik to sleep, ending the trance. Though shaken, the party decided to decipher the prophecy later, when they had reached their destination. After crossing through the Valley of Three Swords, the group arrived at the town of Kalefall, an artisanal trading and forest town. Rancor visited the spot where he first met Arel in this location and encountered Ozin for the first time, still trying to stir the dormant blade. Meanwhile, Ultrix secured safe passage for his father and his brother and sister to the city of Provenere from Kalefall. Tearful goodbyes followed as Daikia parted from her children and her husband. With the family safe en route, Lorem Ipsum now turned north. The pines gave way to snowy hills, and beneath a light summer snowfall, the distant outline of a great city emerged. There, rising amidst the icy white, stood the seven-pointed walls of the theocratic capital of the Alliance of Provias, the beating heart of faith and religion across Ilethia, and home of Owenel. Welcome to Bruntero. Lorem Ipsum, accompanied by Daikia Moxicrol, arrived at the outskirts of Bruntero, again the towering seven-sided theocratic capital of the Alliance of Provias. There, they quickly observed the harsh disparity within the city's population. While the destitute are permitted to live within the outer walls, their existence remains steeped in slums and hardship. Seen by some as charity, by others a hollow performance of grace. Meanwhile, the affluent inner city thrives with divine opulence, its districts each dedicated to the worship of one of the seven gods. After a minor disaster involving the volatile meltdown of Ultrix's maw in the Outer Rookery here in Bruntero, the group split up to handle various personal tasks. Paloma, Rancor, Pura, and Daikia ventured to the moon market of the artisanal district. There, Daikia broke away to gather supplies, while Paloma, under the guise of innocence, shoved Rancor into a vendor stall as a distraction to steal jewelry, unnoticed by all around except for Pura. Paloma later stopped by the Dark Side of the Moons, a general goods shop, where she purchased travel gear and was sternly advised that venturing into the frostbitten waste was frankly a terrible idea. Meanwhile, Rancor and Pura visited a place called the Copper Link, a metalworking enchantment shop run by Relius Vorum. Pura grew frustrated upon learning his javelin, made of wood, would not be of much help to the blacksmith, while Rancor commissioned a new item. The duo then proceeded to Susanna's Sleds and Stuff, where Pura haggled with a hag for a self-propelled sled and a mysterious box of, quote, stuff, end quote. Elsewhere, Ultrix, Zeros, and Owenel, who continued to wrestle with the dread of telling Owenel's mother about Evident's death, visited Total Potion Kits, or better known as TPK, reconnecting with the old alchemical acquaintance of Owenel, known as Jim Burrow, and his mother, Tammy Burrow. There, potions were bought, ingredients were exchanged, and Tammy offered Owenel some quiet wisdom about grief. Following his intuition, Sizik wandered to the base of the Tower of Stelia, where he was welcomed by Pathcarver Jolam Orabel. The two shared tea and a contemplated conversation about prophecy, fate, and what it means to carry a divine burden. Later, Paloma rejoined Ultrix, Owenel, and Zeros outside of Carl & Sons Rock Company, where she cheerfully asked Ultrix to help sell some totally legitimate, as she said, absolutely not stolen, as she said, jewelry. The group then spoke with the shop's three colorful proprietors, Grandpa Carl Co., shop owner Carl Co. with a C instead of a K, and the learning store clerk, their son, Brock Co., to trade various goods here and negotiate prices. And after settling their business and bidding farewell to a particularly rowdy Grandpa Co., they reunited with Sizik and met back up with Rancor and Pura, who had secured rooms at an inn called the Restful Radiance. There, in the lobby, Daikia headed to the party's rented large suite, and Sizik, as a prod of fun, decided to open the mysterious box of stuff for fun, unleashing a flood of 700 cubic feet of whipped cream, plus a couple of adventuring supplies and some shovels, into the middle of the lobby of the inn. As the chaos unfolded, Pura quickly swore to the innkeeper, Thalia Naline, that they would clean up the mess with haste. With rooms secured and whipped cream now shoveled outside, Lorem Ipsum now turns their attention to restocking supplies, tending to personal matters, and preparing for the very cold truths that lie ahead in Bruntero City and beyond. After a brief discussion, Owenel and Zeros made their way to the grand Gothic Church of the Moon Mother within Monsignant Plaza at the heart of the city, seeking to sell Zeros' ancient coin collection. Directed to the reliquary and library, they caught the attention of Vicarant Aramira Ellicent, who had hoped that they would donate the collection instead. However, she offered a diamond necklace in exchange, and after much deliberation, they accepted. Meanwhile, Ultrix struggled to reforge the maw, the ice steel refusing to melt, while Paloma whittled nearby, and Pura, ever the gambler, opened his second box of stuff, temporarily trapping himself in a place called the Mirrorfeld for about 20 minutes or so. Upon his return, Owenel admitted that he could no longer delay the inevitable, and went with Pura and Paloma to the Dazov estate, dreading the moment he would have to tell his mother, Lady Hannah Dazov, of Evident's death. Welcomed by the butler, Hoff Hassel, the group waited until Hannah Dazov entered the living room. As Owenel delivered the grim news, her human guise shattered, revealing her true angelic form. Shaken, she pressed Owenel for details before turning her fury on him, enraged at his failure to protect his sister. The air grew heavier still when Vicarant Anorodazov, Owenel's father, entered, overhearing the confession as he was entering the house outside. He berated Owenel as a disgrace, demanding he leave at once. But as Owenel turned to obey, a sudden insight stopped him cold. His father had slipped, and everyone heard it. Pressing further, he turned around and asked, and Honoro exploded in anger, revealing that the selection of the Vicari was built on lies upon lies upon lies, its people long deceived before storming out of the room. In shock, Owenel turned back to his mother, who wept, confessing her failings as a parent, that in trying to raise him for greatness she had neglected both her children and left evident to her fate. Owenel tried to comfort her, but as he departed, the unthinkable happened. A scream split the air, and the Dazov estate erupted into flames. Owenel raced back to the house, tearing through the burning rubble in desperation, until at last the searing heat killed, or nearly, at least, killed him, and the realization that his mother chose this made the sinking feeling in his chest all the more painful. But as death closed in, Owenel's hammer flared with Helm's light, shielding him from the fire and guiding him back to Pura and Paloma, safely away from the fire, who then dragged him away as the house burned. Meanwhile, Ultrix and Zeros overheard about the commotion and also news that Cyriel, who they had seen in Aukus, who had led the so-called siege, had arrived in the city and was expected to report to the Vicari today. The pair rushed to find their companions and then hoped to head to the Monsignant Plaza. Once reunited in the Crimson City district, Zeros healed Owenel, who then confessed the terrible truth in the open street. The Vicari had lied about how their successors were chosen. Everyone in the street stopped to listen, and his words ignited the crowd, panic boiling over into riot. Enforcers of the Vicari swept into the quell, forcing them to scatter and flee back to their inn at the Restful Radiance. There, Daikia realized the danger. They had little time before the inner city was sealed off. Ultrix, planning to scout routes and gather intelligence on Cyriel's report to the Vicari, had but a moment. He stepped outside. An enforcer seized him. Gathering supplies, the others fled towards the outer city to seek refuge. Both the enforcer and Ultrix, however, moving towards the inner city, watched the sky darken overhead as they approached the city's core. A spiral of gray clouds churned above Monsignant Plaza. A massive spell coalescing as a translucent dome began spreading outward from the city's heart. Ultrix tore free and ran. The truth crashing down upon him, he and his companions had less than an hour to escape Brentero, or be trapped in by this powerful and dangerous spell. Scattered across the unrest-torn streets of Brentero, Lorem Ipsum desperately needed to regroup. In Monsignant Plaza, Ultrix made a break for it, warning his companions and unleashing Cannibal into the fray to cause chaos, and push through the Enforcer barricade before slipping free. In the Moon Market, Zeros found Pura and Paloma, where rioters clashed with Enforcers and the main exits were sealed. They darted into the twisting back alleys, dodging patrols, creating distractions, and forcing the inner city gates open just wide enough to flee through them. In the Outer Rookery, and in the Fifths, at the Hammered Hymnal, another tavern, Sizik, Rancor, Owenel, and Daikia waited for their companions when they received word from Ultrix, and suddenly looters set shop ablaze across the street. Owenel heard a scream from inside the flames and rushed in. But after precious moments passed, Daikia stormed in after him, dragging him out, but too late to save whoever had been trapped other than Owenel. At last, the party regrouped at the northern gate of the outer city. While tending wounds, Ultrix identified the now complete magical dome stretching over Brentero, just as they stepped beyond the city wall. A powerful, modify memory ritual, its implications chilling like the frosted air of the summer snow. With their horses and cart trapped inside, the group braced for a brutal trek on foot into the frostbitten waste, relying on Cricket, which is Owenel's horse, Pura's self-propelling sled, and their own ability to walk. Through blizzard and biting wind, battling hypothermia, dwindling rations, and exhaustion, they pressed onward until at last the silhouette of the northernmost city of Phenorbia came into view. the outline of Blixhaven looming ahead. Its domed walls shimmering against the snow. Within the protection of the Aegis Dome, the port city thrived, its people hardened by the cold and their trade built on the export of ice. Daikia led them to a place she was familiar with, the Whispering Hearth, a cozy geothermal inn run by the elderly elf Thal Rin. Daikia led out their next challenges, telling them that they must stock up on scarce survival gear and, more perilously and critically, locate a fabled tome said to have belonged to the Mad Mage, perhaps the very one who built the Neverfree Spire that they were looking for, and hopefully from there a key to Akadon's location would be revealed. She believed that such a tome may contain the means to navigate the Eternal Blizzard, but if it did in fact exist, it would be locked away in the depths of the Thosserith Archive, under the watch of the White Scribes, who served the Glaciarch and underneath the Vicari, back in Brontero, where they had just left a massive brewing chaos. Gaining access to such an archive would require cunning, influence, strategy, or luck, and perhaps all of them in some combination. But as ideas swirled in their minds and in conversation, Daikia left the tavern alone to scout the city, sharing a brief, heartfelt exchange with Paloma before departing. The rest of Lorem Ipsum stayed behind and ate a hearty fish dinner. Rancor later spoke with Paloma about his past mistakes, giving her a pendant to restrain him should his darker impulses return. While Owenel and Zeros had a tense moment. Owenel, desperate to speak to Helm, grappled with the revelation that Zeros had prayed to such a guide and made contact, though Zeros received a strange, unexpected response from Helm. And night fell over Blixhaven at last, and for the first time in weeks, Lorem Ipsum settled into warmth and quiet as tomorrow awaited them. The next morning, Lorem Ipsum steeled themselves for the task ahead. Daikia set out to scout the Thosserith Archive, while the rest of the party focused on the supplies and planning for their march into the Frostbitten Waste. Ultrix was entrusted with some of the group's pooled coin to acquire needed magical gear. Sizik wandered the city, only to be interrupted by an ominous bell toll and a sudden shift in the glacial ice that supported Blixhaven. Ignoring a whisper from the depths of the crevasse, he instead helped an Ice Genasi stranger build an igloo, uncertain of whether the man built the house or if he was part of it himself, and regaled this stranger with tales of forest and trees, something that the Ice Genasi had never himself seen. Meanwhile, Pura drank downstairs at the inn's bar, as Paloma, Owenel, and Zeros babysat, so to speak, Rancor. And in that quiet moment, Rancor and Zeros guided him into confronting Ozen's silence. Through introspection, Rancor connected once more with the blade's core, for the first time in months, entering inside the blade a bedroom of Shoni, the Oni bound within the sword called Ozen. Shoni admitted his failings, confessing he had tried to push Velmon towards revenge as a lesson, only to endanger him by enabling Rancor's vengeance instead, and that he was sorrowful that he had endangered Lorem Ipsum in the process. At last the Oni acknowledged his bond with Velmon, and though he asked for a way out of the sword, he promised to help purge the darkness that had festered in Velmon's soul. Renewed, Rancor departed the subconscious connection and returned to himself. He felt the familiar hum of Ozen once again in his hands. A couple of hours later, Daikia returned with grim news. The Thosserith Archive had been guarded tightly by the White Scribes, and Owenel added to such news that his severance from his family line made the notion of himself posing as a Vicari envoy much more dangerous. Instead, with Owenel's help, Ultrix forged an impeccable counterfeit document of Vicari authority. Armed with such forgery, the party left their magical items in the care of Owenel and Pura. They passed through checkpoints maintained by the Dome Guard and the White Scribes themselves, and magical detection fields until at last they stood within the archive's subterranean vaults. Chief Archivist Holden Queck, with waited anticipation, verified their credentials. But in private, he later revealed his distaste for the Vicari's corruption to Ultrix, even though he worked underneath them, and with a rare moment of honesty, gave Ultrix a master key and told him to look for what he was looking for in Vault 21, deep into the ice. Though Ultrix chose not to ask how the Chief Archivist knew of Daikia's search or how he had known that Ultrix was her son, he returned, nonetheless, to rejoin the group. Ultrix opened Vault 18A, and Ultrix nearly walked into a lethal sigil protecting it, saved only by Paloma's instinctive tackle. Ultrix returned to speak with the chief archivist, who candidly admitted he had forgotten about such traps because those vaults were sealed off so many years ago and have not been opened. He promptly gave Ultrix the sequence to disable the wards. Ultrix returned down the many flights of spiraling stairs into the ice to disarm the sigilling wards. The party then uncovered rambling journals of the Mad Mage, of the Neverfreeze Spire, and an accompanying jagged blue crystal that Daikia pocketed to investigate later. Deeper still, though, curious by the mysterious vault Holden Queck had spoken of in Vault 21, the Master Key revealed a hidden vault sealed beneath runes of terrifying power, knowledge and secrets of the Alliance of Provius deemed necessary to be locked away by the highest orders of politics. To reach the input panel across a 50-foot chasm of death, Sizik made the attempt, empowered by his sping-loaded leg, as we've called it, his natural rabbit hop, and the dagger form of Ozen in hand, granted by Rancor. He sprinted, leapt across the void, and with a perfect dice roll against all odds, flawlessly landed upon the far edge, clasping to the icy wall. Sizik entered the complex sequence relayed by Ultrix and disarmed the vault. As the wards fell silent and the chamber yawned open, Lorem Ipsum stood on the threshold of secrets, in fact ancient and long buried, truths capable of rewriting the history of the Alliance of Provius. Deep beneath Blixhaven now, Lorem Ipsum finally breached into the forbidden Vault 21, rifling through hidden records of ages long past and times more recent, proof of the Vicari's corruption, lies, manipulations, and wrongdoings. Though they had disabled the lethal glyphs, an alarm spell that they had missed flared to life, alerting Bruntero, far south of here, and Blixhaven's highest authorities. As the weight of this dark history sank in, Chief Archivist Holden Queck came racing down the spiraling staircase, breathless, warning them that the Dome Guard, the Enforcers, the Glaciarch, and 2 Vicarants would be upon them in less than a minute. With no time to spare, the party bolted up 20 floors of winding stairs. Paloma surged ahead to snatch their belongings from the front desk where they had checked in, as the white scribes began to rally and prepare for the arrival of their superiors. Rancor pressed Queck for another way out, and with that information, Zeros uncovered a hidden mechanism in a bookshelf in the back of the ground-level floor of the Thossereth archive, revealing an external passage. As the scribes closed in and the main entrance was sealed off, Ultrix activated the combustion siphon, pulling his companions through before Paloma seized it and dove into the passage, bursting through the outer door with a single second to spare. Gasping, the party raced back to the Whispering Hearth, where they wrestled with what they had uncovered. Rancor unraveled in rage, furious to learn that his childhood tormentors had served the Vicari, and that Vicarant Honoro Dissolve, again Owenel's father, himself had manipulated Owenel's rise to Helm Station, that ultimately led a complication that killed Rancor's parents and took his eyes. Owenel, shaken as well, began to connect these revelations with his own nightmares. Though tempers flared, the group resolved that killing Vicarants would change nothing. The system itself had to change, and the only way that could be done was that the people would have to break the cycle of oppression. But they presently had no time to dwell on such matters. Zeros and Sizik slipped through Blixhaven's alleys to get fitted for their gear, purchased the day before, nearly caught by patrols. Pura searched for a new hideout, and they found the Shiverhole, a disreputable tavern in the southern wall. Meanwhile, Ultrix copied the documents with magic, and Owenel consigned the originals to an icy crevice, hopefully buying us enough time to get before the guards would locate us. Reunited at the Shiverhole, the group played a dice gambling game, and Pura drank questionable beverages, lying low while government forces scoured the streets. After a restless night, they gathered their gear in the morning and slipped beyond the Aegis Dome into the merciless, frostbitten waste. The blizzards howled, the cold gnawed to the bone, and the snow stretched endlessly before them. But with grit, luck, and hard-pressed teamwork, Lorem Ipsum endured their first 2 nights in the white abyss. Yet the frozen north was vast, and their journey into the unknown had only just begun. Lorem Ipsum trudged through the unending desolation of the frostbitten waste. suddenly felt the world itself shift. The glacier underfoot cracked and lurched, splitting apart with a deafening roar. Snow blinded their eyes as they scrambled for safety, diving. And when the chaos stilled, they realized the party had been divided by nature itself. Ultrix, Paloma, Sisik, Owenel, and Daikia stranded on one side of a yawning, impassable chasm, while Pura, Rancor, and Zeros on the other. No rope nor spell could bridge the distance in the blizzard, and with grim acceptance, the companions were forced to part ways and trust that fate, or maybe luck, would reunite them. On their side of the divide, Ultrix and the others found their path barred by another fissure, smaller, but still vast. With ingenuity, he fashioned a crude grappling hook to span the gap, Paloma shimmying across first with dexterous agility. Ultrix then attempted something far bolder, affixing the combustion siphon to the rope and sending the rest of the group inside for Paloma to haul across. But mid-swing, realization struck him. The siphon would in fact slam into the icy wall and shatter, dooming both the device and those within it. In a split-second choice, Ultrix abandoned safety, leaping from the siphon and casting Featherfall to preserve it, resigning himself to fall into the abyss. But Paloma, seeing this unfold, hurled herself down the sheer ice face, a 90-degree angle downward, rope in hand, and with a thunderous sonic boom launched into the void. Against all odds, her outstretched hand caught Ultrix's, and together they swung back to the ledge, hauling themselves and the combustion siphon, and therefore the party's salvation, back to safety. With their breaths quick and their hearts pounding, they pressed on. Days blurred into nights as they crossed thin ice, snowdrifts, and whiteouts, until fate led them into the maw of a nightmare, a polar vortex snow cyclone, a towering spiral of shrieking wind and ice. Certainly, death. Anchors snapped free, gear and weapons torn skyward, and all but Owenel were lifted from the ground and hurled across the frozen plains, leaving them battered and broken. Hours later, bloody and frostbitten, they regrouped, only for night to fall with no time for shelter, no fire, and no food available to them. Exhaustion and cold gnawed at their strength. Hypothermia stalked them like a predator. Ultrix tried to shoulder the burden alone, storing his companions in the siphon again while he trekked forward, but the storm's cruelty made even that impossible. Hope frayed, their strength failed, and then, through the white haze, a miracle held their gaze. Steam rising faintly from the tundra, a geothermal vent. Small but merciful, radiated warmth in the frigid cold. Stumbling into the embrace, the party found fragile respite from the merciless cold. For one night, they could breathe, they could warm, they could regather and live. Yet as they huddled in the warmth, questions pressed on their weary hearts. Where was this tower they sought? Did it actually exist? And could they survive long enough to find it? And somewhere out there in the endless snow, away from them, would their friends be granted the same fragile luck? Lorem Ipsum walked the next morning, the fleeting warmth of a geothermal vent, gathering what little strength remained, and pressed onward on foot in the frost. Thin ice cracked beneath boots, but they crossed without mishap, though their respite was short-lived. Elsewhere, frigid and desperate, Zeros, Rancor, and Pura followed the erratic pool of the shard that Daikia had collected from the Thosserth archive, now known as the Neverfreeze Wayfinder. Stumbling across fresh footprints, they clung to hope and at last reunited with their companions. Together again, the party pressed forth, but each night their camp faltered. Food dwindled, fires failed, and exhaustion and hypothermia gnawed once again at them. Still, they marched over ridges, through blizzards, across hidden cracks of ice until calamity struck. A sheet collapsed beneath them, plunging the party into freezing water, their supplies locking in blocks of ice as they dragged themselves, gasping, back onto the shore. With food trapped in the frozen combustion siphon and little time to make camp that night, only grim determination carried them onward for a few more days. But one dawn brought another terror beyond endurance. Not one, but 3 polar vortex cyclones converging, walls of shrieking ice and wind spiraling towards them. Plans flew like sparks, even more desperate than the last. Until Daikia's immovable rods birthed a daring gambit, Rancor could anchor himself in the cage of rods, clutching the combustion siphon while the others sheltered inside. They enacted a plan with moments to spare. The storm struck, winds tore, the cage rattled, and Rancor was bashed against unyielding steel until only a death ward kept him clinging to life. Fleeing into the Mirrorfeld with potions in hand, he endured while Ultrix and Paloma braced the siphon's interior and Zeros prayed for aid. But Helm answered only with condemnation for Zeros, declaring Zeros a traitor condemned to suffer. When Rancor returned to the material plane, Shoni's warning brought realization that a massive chain link hurling endlessly by the winds thundered towards the cage. Rancor held it back with raw magic, but the vortex battered him mercilessly again, breaking him until his life finally failed. His corpse was left trapped, but the siphon flung loose, and the party scattered across the ice as their gear exploded across jagged rocks. Snow blinded them as they struggled, the roaring funnels bearing down. Death was almost practically certain, until unexplainably the winds shifted. The three cyclones suddenly split apart, spiraling away within the tundra. Silence followed, and relief was fleeting. Rancor's body still lay hundreds of feet away, unmoving, dead, within the cage, and their eyes searched. They froze at what loomed beside them, not 20 feet from where they had landed. The needle of a spire rose from the endless snow. It hadn't been there before, or so they swore it to be the case. But now it pierced the horizon like a jagged wound. At last they had arrived at the Neverfreeze spire, and whatever is contained within its icy walls. Dragging themselves from the snow, though, and brushing away death's icy grip, Lorem Ipsum gathered what strength they could. Zero rushed to Rancor's side. The first attempt failed, his soul lingering in the void, but the second surged with desperate will, wrenching him back to breath in the frozen waste. Before them loomed the Neverfreeze spire, again an impossible needle of jagged ice, 350 feet tall, its pinnacle lost in swirling snow overhead. They rested briefly at the base, before building a fragile fire to stave off exhaustion and then readying themselves for an ascent. The first floor greeted them like a mausoleum, an abandoned monument of frost where a grandfather clock ticked counter to time itself, its hands frozen at 4 and moving backwards. With unease mounting, they scavenged for key fragments, combining them with the Neverfreeze Wayfinder to ascend to the next floor. The second floor warped reality, time bending in loops of resets until Paloma, in a stressful situation, cut into a different version of Rancor to pry the next key free from his heart. On the third floor, a hall of glyphs pulsed with shifting runes, one granting boons, another burning with lightning, and a third offering healing. A hidden passage spared them from seeking another key, but the clock ticked on, and when it struck 12, as it counted down, punishment fell, jagged icicles plummeting from the ceiling, a warning of what awaited if they lingered too long in such a cursed tower. The fourth floor contained a frozen library, where brittle tomes shattered at an icy touch. An inkwell bled into Ultrix's scales, and a phantom entity formed. In a room over, a frozen scribe exploded apart as Sizik uncovered a chilling and familiar line of poetry that he himself had repeated many weeks ago. Steal the scepter and bear the price. In a dusty closet, Zeros befriended a shivering mimic who introduced itself as Mimico, insisting that its sibling, Slimico, awaited the higher floors, and eviler than itself. With another crystal in hand, they ascended again. The fifth floor howled like the storm's throat, a chamber of spiraling wind where another cursed clock ticked down to doom. Here they discovered a harp that sang with a gale, a madness-inducing altar, and a vault sealed by 5 concentric rings etched with the symbols of the elements. On the opposite wall, a riddle in Celestial spoke of such elements and unions. Paloma pieced together the solution, aligning the rings to their matching order in the riddle, unsealing the vault. Within, treasure gleamed, enchanted potions, a frostfire bracelet, weapons of adamantine, glittering gems, and a journal scrap scrawled in the same frantic hand as the Mad Mage's notes from the Phosphorus archive, reading, "They may call me insane, but I will be the unspoken hero. If they sunder my name, I will laugh as I sunder their lands." Yet no crystal key revealed itself. Frustration growing and time ticking down still ever present, they turned back to the wind chamber where the gale finally screamed. Ice sealed the exits and the air crystallized into form. The temperature plummeted, before them emerging a towering ice devil, wings of frost and eyes of icy flare. Its chilling presence enough to choke the breath from their lungs. With nowhere to flee, Lorem Ipsum was faced with no choice but to face the cold wrath of a nefarious devil. Trapped by howling gale and icy barrier, facing off against an ice devil, Lorem Ipsum leapt into combat. Yet through grit, clever coordination, and mustered strength, the fiend was cast screaming back to the hells that spawned it, leaving behind a crystalline shard, the key to ascend to the next floor. On the 6th floor, shifting runes spat beams of elemental fury. A silent phantom traced sigils with skeletal hand, and revealed one word, Abalone. Beyond the room lay only an odd chamber, a levitation room, a perfectly preserved bedroom next to it, where Zero succumbed to an enchanted short slumber, and a frozen summoning circle across the hall with a blackened hand on it. Aldrich's curiosity stirred the circle to life, conjuring a Nothic who bent to its command, plucked a crystal from Xeros's hand, and opened the way forward before vanishing. But the grandfather clock struck 12 again. The walls vanished, and an arctic gale tore through them before the tower reset itself with chilling indifference. The 7th floor proved no kinder. A hearth with a clawed-out portrait of the Mad Mage, but the fireplace flickered to life long enough to warn their bones. A corridor then led on, twisting by shifting gravity that sent them floating as a hooded figure waltzed through. And a half-star crystal was found amidst the chaos. Suspicion lingered as Aldrich incinerated a chest, fearing Slimico the Mimic, only to destroy actual treasure. Oh well. Still, in a gravitational garden of dead plants drifting, found by Xeros, the other half of the crystal was recovered, and then moved onward. On the 8th floor of the tower, an observatory sealed and revealed the planet of Alethea itself through a cracked lens, but the sight twisted Sizek's mind with terror. A tea set frozen beside a phonograph that shrieked its last whispers of the greatest failures of our characters filling their ears, gnawing at their sanity. But a crystal was claimed here, and the word Abalone opened an obsidian door to secret treasures, among them the next shard they needed. Paloma, Ultrix, and Daikia fixed a broken constellation orb which granted a boon, and Xeros took a cold iron ring off a long-dead servant's skeleton. Mimico, their strange companion, refused to follow as they ascended to the 9th floor, where an endless pit screamed the wind beneath a rickety bridge. Paloma sprinted the wall with acrobatic grace, while the others braved the treacherous planks, retrieving a nonagon crystal that unlocked the stairwell above. At the final floor, the 10th, a corridor opened into a grand hall of statues and frost, and upon the throne, buried in 6 feet of eternal ice, lay the skeletal form of what once was to be the Mad Mage, clutching the glowing staff that they are looking for. Xeros confirmed the body was long dead, but its prison hummed with unnatural strain. Sizek shattered the barrier, and the group hacked through the ice. Sizek seized it, prying the staff from both the grasp of Ultrix and the frozen fingers of the corpse. For one heartbeat, silence. Then the frost groaned, the temperature plunged, and a thunderous voice roared, "Give it back." The body convulsed, the skeletal remains, the ice cracking with veins of blinding light, until the mage's remains exploded into shards and a towering blizzard took shape. Pale eyes flared within the storm as the snow tempest wraith rose, a monstrous cyclone of rage and cold. The grand hall became a battlefield of screaming winds and walls of ice and white oblivion itself. Visions faltered, movement slowed, and the storm struck mercilessly, nearly breaking our adventurers. Yet through blood and determination, Lorem Ipsum turned the tide, shattering the elemental abomination of a mage who became the storm. The silence that followed was perhaps deafening. The ice lay broken and the air stilled. A calmness, and in Sizek's trembling hands, the staff pulsed with power and consequence. The price to pay lingered, and they could all feel it. Their quest brought them here, but now exhausted, Lorem Ipsum must decide. Will they continue to pursue what the Blizzard Wizard had fought to bury? The howling winds had fallen silent now, the storm's fury dissipating with the defeat of the Mad Mage's elemental wraith spirit, leaving Lorem Ipsum in the shattered remains amid ice and victory. They brushed the snow from their faces, the sting of frost still burning their skin, and they took stock of their wounds. Flesh torn, limbs numb, will frayed. But one absence chilled them more than the cold itself. Sizek was gone, and so was the scepter he was holding. Around them, the tower no longer seemed to whisper threats, though. The cursed clocks, once ticking downward towards doom, now showed the real hour, late afternoon. Exploring the Neverfreeze spire, they found its horrors had been quelled, its magic dormant, and they took refuge on the 7th floor, where a lonely hearth crackled faintly against the frost. For the first time in many days, they truly rested, half a day's slumber granting some ease of their exhaustion. Some lingered by the fire, while Paloma, Daikia, and Pura descended back to the base of the tower, studying a cracked teleportation circle buried in frost in the gantry. Powering it was possible, but the cost uncertain, and even if they could, should they? Escape meant abandoning the frostbitten waste and the purpose that had brought them here, which was, in fact, the search for Akadon. After long deliberation, they chose resolve over retreat. Better they find Akadon than whatever hands might follow instead. As plans formed for the trek ahead, Daikia and Paloma still searched for Sizik, finding only silence and swirling drafts of air that led downwards. Now, with the rest of the group, they followed the pull of the air to the base of the tower once again to find Sizik standing at the threshold, scepter in hand, stones orbiting its core as a column of light pierced the clouds above. Before they could question him, Rancor's anger erupted, fear and fury colliding as he accused Sizik of recklessness. Sizik fired back, however, frustrated and sharp, the air crackling with tension until Paloma stepped between them, revealing the truth long hidden. Rancor was not one man, but two, Velmon and Rancor, halves of a whole torn by vengeance. Rancor, the vengeance side, refused to stand down, but Paloma, carrying the failsafe given by Velmon weeks before in Blixhaven, used it to halt him before rash actions could be taken. The storm may have been at bay, but now a colder divide ran through the group. Their journey resumed beneath a heavy sky, and Sizik, now attuned to the scepter, guided them across the waste with a steady beam of blue light, while Pura, driven to madness and exhausted in the endless cold, prayed to the deity Lepelon and threw himself upon geothermal vents in a half-frozen act of faith. Days bled into nights once again, snow turned to ice, until at last, after another week of traveling, unrelenting, they crested a ridge, and before them stretched a vast crater-like bowl, carved into the tundra, and the scepter's beam converged upon the center of it. After all their suffering, their brushes with death, and their many trials prior to this moment, Lorem Ipsum, finally, had arrived at their true destination. The wind howled across the ridge, as Lorem Ipsum peered into the vast, snow-choked basin below, the beam of Sizik's staff cutting through the white haze like a blade of light. They were about to descend when a crunch of snow behind them shattered their focus. Turning sharply, they beheld two figures wearily emerging from the storm. Marek, a human Asimir warrior, in tattered robes and armor and a long-dulled sword by the cold. And Genevieve, a half-frozen bard, clutching her lute as though it alone kept her alive. Their faces were exhausted, their eyes hollow with the kind of fatigue that only months of survival in the frostbitten waste could truly bring. They introduced themselves, explaining they had followed the party's tracks after losing their own expedition. Their other four companions were dead, their mission a failure, to find one of their friends that had unfortunately also not survived the frigid terrors of the endless blizzard. But suspicion lingered. But desperation, then again, makes for strange allies, and survival demanded cooperation. So, with cautious trust, Lorem Ipsum accepted Marek and Genevieve into their group, and continued towards the beam's destination. The basin was eerily quiet, but the ground cracked beneath their feet. In an instant, the world gave way, swallowing them in a thunderous collapse of snow and stone. Their fall gave way to their landing, cushioned by the snowdrifts that had fallen with them. But when they arose, they found themselves no longer in the waste, but beneath them. Strange metallic and stone walls surrounded them, etched with irregular geometric patterns. The air thick with static. Akadon. They could hardly believe it, but the signs were unmistakable. The buried city had been found. Another rumble above urged haste, and they pressed forward through the corridors of steel and stone, the architecture alien yet deliberate, ancient yet impossibly advanced. A yawning pit, however, halted their progress underground until the group discovered a shattered transit hub, denoted by a copper plaque written in a script only Paloma could identify as Auran. Using their own magic to power the dormant system of the platform, they wrenched the now floating platform craft from its rails and fashioned it into a makeshift lift, riding it through and down through the multiple levels of the ruins. Separated briefly, they explored what remained: dark research labs, deep forge welding chambers, quality control rings, and hollow corridors humming faintly with residual power. Terminals flickered with arcane interfaces, walls bore sigils that pulsed with planar energy, and some of the materials here entirely in this area were otherworldly. The dangers here were apparent, but the potential for understanding and research and knowledge stood fully in grandeur. The intent was much more in question. The stress of exploration weighed upon them, tension shimmering between old companions and new arrivals alike. Still, curiosity could lead us further, and the quest for knowledge was to continue. Deeper into the buried heart of Akadon, Lorem Ipsum pressed further, descending sublevel by sublevel into the forgotten remains of a civilization lost to time. Each chamber whispered of impossible knowledge, sigil matrices tied to quantum coordinates, threads of arcane realities suspended, studies of a dreamscape and echoic grids, essence extraction labs where flora and fauna had been distilled into raw energy, and transcripts preserved in crystalline inscriptions. In the memory archive nucleus of Sublevel 10, the party uncovered a digital library of sorts, and with it a small handheld device that spoke with a voice of its own, identifying itself as Mirex, a semi-sentient arcane codex of intellect. But wonder was not alone in this exploration. Dread was also found at every corner. Arcane biohazards leaked radiation into hallways, vials of sentient ink clawed at their glass prisons, and threads of warped reality twisted space around any who dared touch it. By the time Lorem Ipsum reached Sublevel 12's Project Nullforge engine bay, a sense of unease had built. Within a vast container of glass and steel, suspended surgical arms reached into the chamber with a swirling gray ether floating and churning inside it. Runes etched in celestial script, zeros drawn by some unnatural instinct beyond mortal comprehension, approached the chamber. And before anyone could stop them, their hand struck the already fracturing glass. The tank exploded into a burst of shattering, and Zeros reached in to absorb the ethereal fluid, 26 souls. Sizik, acting on pure instinct, banished Zeros from the plane as the others reeled in panic. When Zeros returned, they were quickly restrained. Nothing physically had changed. But then she appeared. A woman draped in black and crimson, skin pale as bone, bright red lips, eyes dull and cold. Her presence chilled the air. No one moved. She hovered inches above the ground, the iron pendant on her throat gleaming faintly. The right hand of the soul matron herself. The party contemplated intervening, but held back as she turned her gaze solely to Zeros. Their conversation was heavy with sorrow. She spoke of ancient wrongs, of stolen souls. She revealed something new. Zeros was not merely touched by the divine as a cleric. They were, in fact, the cursed god Null, long exiled, carrying within them the devoured soul of their greatest follower, Reaper. The revelation tore at the tense air. The Nullforge chamber was realized. It had been built to extract and experiment on such an entity. The woman's tone softened, sorrow poorly concealed on her face, even though it looked like death. Freeing such a soul was possible within Zeros, within Null, but not without a consequence and a bit of paradox. Zeros faltered, unable to choose between obliteration and a continued cycling. Her expression conveyed grief as she turned to go, fading into mist. Her final words lingered in the stale, cold air of the room. If things change, tell Reaper that Delalore sends her regards. And then, just as soon as she had arrived, she was gone, leaving Lorem Ipsum alone to deal with such a massive and heavy revelation, far below the surface of the world. Deeper still, Lorem Ipsum ventured into the ruins of Akadon, only now confirming they had been exploring just one fragment of a falling metropolis, an area known as Akadon Core. The deeper they went, the stranger the world became. Hallways folded in on themselves, time stretched and stuttered, and rooms itself defied gravity. They passed through shattered energy plexuses that hummed with static and smelled of burning metals. Empty research quarters that whispered their names to them if they stood too long, and archives filled with technologies both wondrous and some useless. Echoes of brilliance and absurdity long buried together. Pura discovered a pen that wrote his inner thoughts in the air without him asking to do so. And after much needed rest in the deep forge chamber, the group pressed onward, descending further into the core's forgotten depths. It was there in the time-lock simulation center of sublevel 17 that Paloma and Pura uncovered another ancient construct half buried in the rubble while still maintaining a bit of power. Once freed, it rose to its full 7-foot height, 3 eyes aglow with yellow light, and it introduced itself as Kaizal. Unlike Mirex, this machine remembered its task and functions from long ago. Through fragmented recollection, Kaizal explained that the SY system was Akadon's calendar, measuring time from the day Akadon arrived from its previous predecessor to here on the planet of Alethea. The implication, however, sent a chill through the group. If Akadon arrived here, where from? And how? But for now, they could at least focus on what they could understand. Kaizal confirmed that an entity known as Cortuxic, believed to hold the knowledge that they were seeking, or at least would be useful, was not housed within the core, but rather another location known as the Northeast Plate, a different section of the city presumably cut off during the fall. No internal access had been found by our adventurers to reach it. They would need to return to the surface of the frostbitten waste, yet before they could depart, Kaizal insisted on examining the tether nodes further down in the Akadon core itself. Massive arcane anchors that once bound Akadon in place where it floated above the world. One node, position 4, still hummed faintly with power, its crystalline Anacontachi octagon structure intact. That is a 98-sided polyhedron. Because it now served no greater system, Kaizal recommended they remove it, believing its residual energy might yet serve another purpose. The party investigated further, noticing how the fallen city's gyroscopic stabilizers had obviously failed catastrophically. Chains that held it in place snapped taut, likely tearing the city apart mid-descent, leaving its plates scattered across the tundra. But then again, if the city floated initially, how did it fall? And that another question and another answer that we did not have yet. At Tether Node 1, however, still here in the inner tether nodes, the design changed. Instead of the crystalline core, a network of ducts and conduits veined into the walls, channeling somewhere deeper still. Another mystery left for a bit later discovery, ever present in the mind. But with their findings, they gathered, and Kaizal's guidance leading the way, Lorem Ipsum returned to the floating platform, ascended the chasm towards the frozen surface once more. The lizard howled overhead in the middle of the night, and they hurried across the tundra to another collapse site, what they had heard earlier that when they arrived, just a quarter mile away, hoping this was the Northeast Plate itself, as it was located in the northeast direction. As they descended into a collapsed section, they found themselves in an aerial transit bay. The machinery in this space was far more sophisticated than what they could ever have seen with the modern Ilethian airships. A notion, again, of Akadonian advancements far above and beyond the world as we know it. And a theory that some things in the cosmos don't quite add up given what we know now. But another section of the lost city of Akadon awaited our discovery. Descending from the white oblivion of the frostbitten waste, Lorem Ipsum guided their floating platform into the yawning maw of an ancient aerial hangar. A vast chamber lined with these airships unlike any crafted in the modern age, sleek and alive with arcane machinery. These vessels shimmered with self-shifting metal, runic engines, and mind-linked controls that pulsed with residual thought. Pura naturally claimed one as his own, attuning to the ship's sentience and declaring himself its captain. And after a bit of time, offered a somewhat eager Paloma to take the position of co-pilot within its cockpit. The party's exploration of the Northeast Plate began in earnest, winding through the hangar bay and down the old corridor until they discovered a functioning rapid lift core, an elevator of sorts, with properly and promptly malfunctioning, though, as they got it stuck. However, a well-meant jump to jar it loose turned disastrous as the lift plummeted 20 floors down, slamming nearly into sublevel 20 of the Northeast Plate, with bone-rattling force. The fortune followed, however, such folly. As the doors slid open, they found themselves right at the entrance into the Project Cortoxic Deep Feedback Terminal, the construct that they had been searching for. How convenient. While Paloma and Rancor examined the skeletal remains slumped over the main chair, Ultrix and Kaisal worked to repair the lift. Meanwhile, Marek, Genevieve, and Pyrrha investigated a nearby critical emergency bunker, where the last words of a doomed Acadonian were carved across the walls. Notes of despair, hunger, and slow madness, marking the final hours of isolation that gave way to insanity and then death. They were trapped. In another wing, Sizik, Owinel, and Daikia found a Timeflux drift catcher array, a machine designed to stabilize temporal flow. Here, Sizik released a still-living moth suspended mid-flap in the tuning ring. Back in the terminal, however, Rancor and Paloma settled their debate over who would be the first to interface with the Cortexic system by sitting in the chair. A quick game of boulder parchment shears, and Paloma losing, taking a seat. She connected, the world around her blurred, and she entered a dreamlike communion with an entity, Cortexic. A confused but still conscious construct. It gifted her a mental map of Akadon, or at least what Akadon looked like when it was still together. Though much of its memory remained locked, restricted by means of missing authorization codes and access levels. It suggested, however, a solution, resetting itself, using Mirex, the device that Paloma held. After regrouping and debating such risk, the party chose caution, opting to gather more data and explore further before taking such a step. Ascending on the newly repaired lift to sublevel 7, they powered on Cortexic's mainframe, gleaning fragmented details of its function while Akadon was operational. Here, Ultrix's curiosity led him to the Project Dialacon control hub. There he discovered a defunct terminal monitoring a floor dedicated to phasing experiments, materials caught halfway between planes, existing both, yet in truly neither. The signal to that lab, however, had been lost, according to the terminal that Ultrix gave some energy to. Elsewhere, Paloma studied the research thesis vault, where a longbow device awoke upon her entrance and attacked on sight before being subdued by the group. Paloma also unearthed an indecipherable and unknown spell scroll, its symbols alive with meaning beyond mortal language. Using Mirex, she learned it was a 12th level spell, a remnant of a power beyond mortal accessibility. After studying their discoveries for a bit, the group returned to Paloma's ship on sublevel 1 to rest. The hum of ancient air filters to the elemental plane of air, granting fresh air and long-sought warmth. But suspicion brewed. Rancor, wary of the newcomers, approached Genevieve in private and requested a drop of her blood, promising only to seek the truth. She agreed, hesitant but trusting, when Rancor used his enchanted glasses to reveal and read the truth of her identity. The book fell from his trembling hands. Within it, stark letters upon the page were words that chilled him to his core. This was Genevieve Songweaver, daughter of the Titanium Blade. Rancor's fury erupted the moment Genevieve's true lineage was unveiled. Daughter of Azhozal, the Titanium Blade, one of the individuals linked to his own tragic background and tied to the several ill-doings on behalf of the Vakari, including the one that took away Rancor's parents. But while Rancor teetered between vengeance and paranoia, the rest of Lorem Ipsum saw only a frightened bard blindsided by revelations she never knew were hers, punctuated by her immediate decision to cast Zone of Truth on herself as a gesture of sincerity. As the team pressed for answers, Genevieve and Marek finally revealed the truth of their presence in the Frostbitten Waste. They had been sent here to see if they could find a woman named Daikia, and find any information about Akadon for their employers, but the mission had collapsed when their lieutenant, an individual named Quinny, abandoned them after their comrades had died horribly in the snow. They survived 2 months alone in frigid cold, and it had reshaped their loyalties, and had brought them, desperate and half-frozen, into absolute chance encounter with this group, Lorem Ipsum. Yet Rancor still spiraled, flickering violently between Veltwan's calmer demeanor to the rage-soaked persona of Rancor. After a night's rest, unable to control the darker half of his fractured soul, he snapped, leading Daikia to sedate him with a potent concoction of sleep. With the tensions high and time slipping away, the group debated their next move. Scour Akadon inch by inch, or take the far more risky gamble of resetting Cortexic. The threat of rival seekers drove them towards that risk. On sublevel 20, Paloma initiated the Cortuxic reset protocol, threading arcane precision through Murex's guidance as the ancient and arcane construct awakened itself with its ethical directives, revealing a history of overrides and violations. But mid-sequence, a further disaster struck. Cortuxic lacked the actual energy and power it needed to complete the reset, and it would erase itself catastrophically within 2 hours unless the group restored energy to the system. Splitting up, Lorem Ipsum raced across multiple sublevels in a frantic search for Project Everpulse, uncovering scattering clues, scorched labs, missing core components, living shadow anomalies, and, at last, on sublevel 17, a displaced central reactor waiting for an anchor to spark it back to life. When Genevieve set the anchor into place, the Everpulse reactor roared awake. The runic rings spun and lurched into motion. A surge of power began to push the reactor far beyond safe limits. Lorem Ipsum converged on the chamber, working desperately to dismantle, disable, or control the escalating reaction, but quickly realized the core was mere seconds away from a massive energy discharge, perhaps the one that had ended Akadon many years ago. Their only option now was to redirect the energy elsewhere. They could no longer direct it through the city, because it was no longer intact. They worked frantically, channeling magic, makeshift materials, and instinct combined into a single upward vector. Then, doing all they knew that they had time to do, they dove behind debris and barrier, hiding themselves, and waited. Suddenly, the reactor abruptly paused. There was silence for several seconds of quiet after the roaring hum ceased. And then a piercing blast of energy, concentrated, a blinding pulse erupting from the reactor cap directly upwards, a column of light and plasma ripping through the sublevels above, through stone and steel and otherworldly material, and then through the frozen surface overhead. Material was thrown into the upper atmosphere. Snow is vaporized in a 12-mile radius around the surface of Akadon, and the overcast clouds are shoved back hundreds of miles, all in an instant, against this massive force. A vast laser lances upwards, piercing the night sky as it shifts towards dawn, and that beam hits the watery moon Felro, and the moon falls. As Felro lurches out of its orbit, pulling closer to Alethea, the sky begins to tear with falling shards of ground and snow. Lorem Ipsum watches the Everpulse reactor settle into a volatile but now stable, at least for now, hum, like catching a breath after a scream. Above, in the hangar bay, Pura feels the ground convulse as entire sections of the ceiling shear loose. His beloved Akadonian vessel is slammed into a docked ship in a grinding shriek of metal, leaving its hull damaged and its sigil grid engine torn through. Below, the rest of the party races through the shifting corridors of the Northeast Plate, rigging old power lines from sublevel 16 to the Everpulse core on sublevel 17, connecting it to a broader system. And when the energy finally reached Cortuxic, it surged across the plate. Ancient mechanisms, dead for millennia, jolt awake with force before Cortuxic wrests control and reroutes the power flow, awakening only systems that it deemed useful. But water rushed in from somewhere else, spilling rapidly into the sublevel, and as Aneris crest over the horizon and the first rays of dawn catch the snow-ridden surface overhead, the truth settles. Felro is indeed falling, and the storm of debris now streaking across the sky promises a meteor cascade within the next 24 hours, and perhaps a far worse event. Determined to salvage what they could, Zeros, Paloma, and Ultrix interrogate Cortuxic, learning to Paloma's surprise that her reset of the construct via Mirex had made her the supreme leader of Akadon, putting herself even over the actual existing leadership of Akadon back then, which was the Magisterium Conclave. However, titles bring little comfort, especially as water levels continue to rise at rapid rates. Cortuxic identifies the source of the water, though, in sublevel 13, which was sealed off due to a elemental rift of water. Now all that contained the water, and that was contained, leaking downward through collapsed layers. With time against them, the group divides. Ultrix decided that he would investigate the submerged level with Owenal, while Pura would lead the others, minus a missing Rancor who had stormed off earlier, to surface, and then in search of another location of Akadon known as the South Plate. The snowless waste bare the surface ground in which Akadon is buried long under. Only a few puddles of water remain from the vaporized snow and blizzard in this area from barely an hour ago. After combining the jagged landscape and combing it to see what they could find, they find, in fact, an entrance to the West Plate, which is miraculously still connected to the South Plate, barely, through a somewhat usable corridor. Passing through the shimmering security field that strips illusions, burns away false sigils, and dissolves scrying magic, they enter the South Plate's cargo bay, only to find that its lone ship, like what they had found on the Northeast Plate hangar bay, was split solely in half, and its dormant Kaisel units were damaged, needing lengthy repairs. Meanwhile, on the Northeast Plate, Arcane waited as Ultrix slipped through a narrow breach in sublevel 12 above and descended into the drowned expanse of sublevel 13. A conjured light is all that cuts through the murky waters as he hovers himself down. The rope grows taut a number of times, then slack, then still. Minutes pass. Owenel doesn't even realize what is happening, and the surface of the water remains unbroken, and Ultrix does not, in fact, return. Rancor's voice, later on, frantically spills through the chatter crystals. Hurry, Ultrix is dead. The rest of Lorem Ipsum sprinted across the fractured landscape, returning from the South Plate, then to the West Plate, then back to the Northeast Plate, hearts pounding as they descended into the sublevels to find Owenel kneeling in a small puddle of cold water beside Ultrix's limp body. The last dust of failed revivify spells that he had attempted across Ultrix's chest. Paloma took over for Owenel to continue CPR, hoping to manually bring Ultrix back to life. As Zeros and the others arrived, shock rippling through the group while they tried to piece together what had happened. With grim resolve, they carried Ultrix's corpse back across the ravaged surface to the West Plate's medical ward, where Mirex activated ancient surgical technology and illuminated the true extent of his injuries. Broken bones, a punctured lung, deep lacerations, and the unmistakable signs of drowning. And if that hadn't killed him, he would have bled out to death. Zeros prepared a stronger revival ritual than what Owenel could cast, while Paloma guided ethereal surgical arms with precision. Genevieve sang a stirring melody. Marek offered steady support. Pura invoked Lepelon through an improvised dance prayer, and Rancor clutched Ultrix's cold dragon hand, whispering desperate pleas for him to return. The diamond dust from Zeros swirled into a radiant funnel as Zeros grappled for Ultrix's soul, only to reach it and feel it recoil, resisting the pull, refusing to return to the body it once inhabited. The spell completed, yet failed. Grief washed through the room, hope crumpled beneath the weight of a grim reality, and the group fractured into private mourning. Paloma tore apart a room in rage. Zeros withdrew to the storm-cleared surface to stand beneath rare, shimmering daylight after speaking with Paloma. Rancor returned in hollow silence to the site where he first found Ultrix's body with Owenel, while the rest carried the corpse back to the hangar bay to Pura's ship. They had wrapped Ultrix in cloth and placed him gently inside a chilled room. Hours had passed. They minded their own business in private solitude and mourning. Dusk bled to early night as they began to discuss the future, until a sudden crash echoed from inside the damaged ship behind them. The side door of the ship slid open to reveal Ultrix himself staggering out, alive. Maybe. But there was no time to process the impossible before a meteor struck across the sky and slammed into the ice overhead, collapsing part of the hangar roof onto our heroes. Chaos immediately ensued and erupted as the group scrambled to decide whether this was truly Ultrix or an uninvited imposter, all while instinct screamed to flee into the depths to shield themselves from what was overhead. As they darted towards the descent shaft, Pura looked skyward, and frozen for an instant, Felro hung impossibly close. Its oceanic shell ruptured, spilling a deluge of water and ground into the upper atmosphere of Ilethia, and a titanic wall of water stretched for hundreds of miles, thundered across the frostbitten waste straight towards them. They reached the lift as the first surge crashed into the hangar bay, sealing the doors seconds before floodwaters hit. The group plunged to sublevel 17 with speed, hoping to fire the Everpulse reactor to repel the moon that was now falling, only to watch water pour through the open hole to the surface, flooding the chamber seconds later. In frantic retreat, all but Ultrix sprinted towards the descent shaft where they had just came from to seal themselves in sublevel 7, but Zeros, in doing so, turned off the Everpulse reactor, while Ultrix, unmoving and breathing underwater as if it were air, swam upwards against the current to sublevel 13, where he inverted the dimensional rift, redirecting its pull towards the elemental plane of fire and siphoning the waters away. Half an hour later or so, Felro had drifted far enough away that the wall of water was no longer bearing down upon them. The tide of destruction slowed. The water ceased pouring into Akadon. Lorem Ipsum retrieved Ultrix from the now drained chamber of sublevel 13. The lower sublevels are likely still entirely submerged, and the reactor was in fact offline, but one thing was certain. Crisis had passed. But a greater mystery remained, as every eye turned to Ultrix, who had died, chose to stay dead, and yet, somehow, had returned to life. As the floodwaters drained away in the wounded depths of Akadon, Paloma finally voiced the question hanging over all of them. What happened to Ultrix? Unfortunately, Ultrix could offer little to no answers, recalling neither his death nor his return in clarity. Unaware that an attempted revival spell had tried to call him back and that he had chosen to stay dead. Zeros looked inward, seeing that Ultrix's soul was not with him, raising only more questions. But with no clarity to be found, Lorem Ipsum instead decided to figure that mystery out at a later time, and instead choose survival and escape, ready to depart Akadon at last. Ultrix descended once more to sublevel 17, now submerged, to dismantle the underwater Everpulse reactor, recovering the second alive and well anchor of Akadon, and salvaging critical components of such a reactor, while the rest of the group regrouped with Cortuxic at the mainframe on sublevel 7. Reunited and now joined by a rotund rune-carving construct named Lambda that Ultrix had found, the group traveled up the hangar bay on sublevel 1, where Pura was able to save Kaizal even if it could not save his ship. Paloma then guided them across the surface to the west plate to find an ancient teleportation chamber that lay dormant. By sheer miracle and memory, Pura recalled the exact sigil sequence of a teleportation circle beneath Provenere, though exhaustion forced him into a brief vital rest before the spell he could cast could carry them away from here. As they waited, the party split up to make use of their time in their waiting. Paloma ventured into a deeper sublevel and recovered 7 spell scrolls from an old cache, delivering them to Ultrix, while Zeros and Rancor descended to sublevel 11 and uncovered a place known as Project Reality Vision, an elite Magisterium Conclave experiment built to alter reality itself. There, a strange device fractured perception, pulling Rancor partially from his body and attempting to overtake Zeros' mind. Yet Zeros resisted and uncovered a chilling report from an Acadonian Archmagister, indicating that the dangers of such a reality chip existed because they had gained sentience. However, Zeros thought of a way to utilize such a powerful device to address the celestial body falling out of the sky overhead. Meanwhile, in the medical ward, Paloma and Velmon shared a harrowing reckoning, culminating in a surgical gambit. With steady hands and relentless focus, Paloma cut out the corrupted essence of Rancor from Velmon's soul, freeing him at last. Barely, at tremendous risk. Above, however, after debate, Ultrix agreed to Zeros' proposal. The reality chip was brought into alignment with the anchor of Akadon, its core igniting with a condensed mote drawn from the Ilethian Nexus thousands of years ago, the Nexus itself which had collapsed 21 years ago during the penultimate. Against staggering odds, Zeros, however, held a great degree of control as the Nexus flared back to life by their design and intention, catching the moon that was falling, Felro, like a celestial net, easing it into a new yet stable orbit, weaving the cascading debris of the moon and the world alike into a radiant planetary ring that encircled Ilethia. With the world spared and Pura finally rested, Lorem Ipsum activated the teleportation circle and vanished from Akadon, reappearing in the depths of the city of Provenere in the dead of night, within the long-abandoned Bright Shadow alchemical facility. Returned at last, the group readied themselves to make their way back to the Kosal Chateau. and to face a city much different from the one that they had left 4 months ago. That concludes all of this episode of Arcane Adventures Recapped. Until we meet again, the adventure continues.